My special guest this afternoon is a professor of political science and global studies at California State University, San Marcos. His new book, Post-Election Violence in Africa, The Impact of Judicial Independence, was published by the Routledge Taylor and Franz Group. Professor Meshack, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anotida. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. I am more than happy to have you today. I was looking forward to this. I earlier on read your article on the role of the courts in mitigating election violence in Nigeria, and fortunately, the web directed me to post-election violence, and here we are.
Yes, yes.
It has actually become a trend in African politics that the presidential outcome of the election is not decided by the casting of the ballot or by announcing the winner on just immediately after the votes are counted, but are normally decided by the courts after some serious debate, with one group arguing that the election was not free and fair, whilst the other arguing that that was the best that could be done, and it actually reflects the will of the people. Your book provides a very interesting insight into these aspects. How did you conceive the idea for this book, and what do you consider to be its central argument?
This idea came to me actually while I was still doing my graduate work. I am originally from Kenya. I saw this idea of and the issues of election violence quite familiar to me, and so I was always fascinated. Why is it that, when elections are not being conducted, people get along really well, regardless of your social ethnic background? But then during elections, people kind of turn against each other. So when I got into my PhD program, I was really interested in trying to explore this question and trying to see the extent to which I could ideally maybe contribute some solution or some of the ways to better understand how election violence manifests itself, particularly within this periodic, within episodically, so to speak, right? Mm. And so my paper that I was working on in my graduate school, right after I had taken my comprehensive exams, was looking the extent to which maybe the courts can actually help explain or constrain post-election violence. And so while I was working on this paper and I'm running all the analysis, I was actually seeing that there was a correlation between post-election violence and the courts. And unfortunately, the relationship was actually positive. So I was pretty much flabbergasted, for lack of a better word. I went back to my chair and I said, I'm running this analysis, but it's not lining up theoretically with what I had theorized, because it does not make sense that when you actually have courts that are more independent, you end up seeing more election violence. Mm-hmm. because when I went in there, my thinking was, if you have courts that are independent and they're more likely to act as an impartial dispute resolution institution, people are less likely to actually go out on the streets when they lose elections and instead go to the courts to get a fair ruling, right? But what I was, the correlation I was seeing as I was running this data was giving me a direction that was different from what I had anticipated. So when I was talking to my professor, she pointed me to some work that had been done by Rachel Elliott. And Rachel Elliott is also one of researchers that she has done work on Malawi and Zambia. But when I was reading her work, I actually was able to come away with some things that informed my research a little bit better. Because I was able to understand that if you look at the judiciary, you can actually see that we have variation in the levels of judicial independence. So you will have countries that are that have judiciaries that are dependent on the executive. Then you'll have some country in the middle that have some form of independence, judiciaries have some form of independence. And then on the extreme, you have actually countries that are have very independent judiciaries. And I'm going to explain later on what I mean by this type of variation. So long story short, then, I was able now to go back and go into the field and now start looking at particularly do a field work in Kenya to really get an idea of how the process through which the judiciary had gone through from 1992, when Kenya has the first multi-party elections, to actually where it was in 2017. And through that, I could actually see that there was a trajectory whereby the first period of time, you can see that the executive was very much reliant on the executive in terms of recruitment, appointment, and tenure, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And over time, until 2010, when Kenya gets a new constitution, is when now you actually see a semblance of an independent judiciary. And so to your question, how did I arrive at this project? This was actually a paper that I was writing, but because of the findings I had, I ended up going back and making this dissertation research and doing field work. It was able to now turn into a bigger project that could not just be accommodated into one paper. So then ended up becoming a book project.
What is, according to your perspective, or from your findings, how do you define, or what's your understanding of judicial independence, and why does it matter?
There's and I think there's a value in trying to differentiate between judicial authority and judicial independence. Mm-hmm. So you as a citizen of your country, when you have an issue, you can, or for the most part, let's say, go to the court and say that you're going to expect the court to be impartial in its ruling, right? And so the idea of judicial independence is really simply can be defined as the extent to which the judiciary as the arm of government is not constrained in its work by the executive. And so what we saw, particularly for most of the sub-Saharan African countries, starting from in the independence times, 1957, Ghana gets independence, and then all these sub-Saharan African countries are starting to fight for independence, and then they have their own governing institutions. What we saw is that a lot of institutions were actually sacrificed, particularly, where you have actually countries reverting to one-party states. With one-party states, then those constitutions are rejigged to extend that now the president is the one who can appoint the judges. He can fire the judges whenever he wants. He determines the tenure and retirement of those judges. He determines the extent to which the judiciary is actually also funded in terms of budgetary allocations. And so we see that within that time period, from the 1960s all the way to 1990s, a lot of African countries have severely anemic judiciaries because, for the most part, they are controlled by the executive. So by judicial independence, then we are meaning that the judiciary as a separate arm of government can actually be able to function and exercise their powers without being constrained by the executive. And so what then you see is as you've actually seen in some of the countries like Kenya, nullifying of the elections. You saw also in Malawi, and then you also saw in Zambia. I think in Zambia also the court was involved in ruling about the outcome of the elections. Is that the courts have now been able to gain a little bit more of authority in terms of actually embedding themselves and exercising embedding themselves within the politics, but also exercising their power in for the most part, ruling impartially without fearing the ramifications of the executive. And that is a testament to the fact that most African countries, for the most part, then have been able to kind of go back after, starting elections and have been able to professionalize, the judiciaries. They've been able to now of course, rewrite the constitutions if you so choose, to be able to give the judiciaries enough power to actually exercise, their power without any constraints.
I'm so sure that there are specific countries that you could have used as case studies to justify both your theoretical and empirical underpinnings. What countries did you study and why?
So the book itself has two components. It has the quantitative analysis, which is just the cross-national analysis of sub-Saharan African countries, 49 sub-Saharan African countries. And then I also have two in-depth case studies focusing on Kenya and Uganda. And so let me just speak real quick about the cross-national analysis. So one of the things, again, is that when I was looking at this idea, I was really interested in seeing how does this relationship hold across sub-Saharan African countries. And so luckily, there's a professor called Linsa and then Staton, two professors that actually put together this data on the judicial independence across the world, but I was able to kind of get just data that focus on African countries. And so to be able to kind of run an analysis that would be more generalizable, I was able to use that, election violence data and election data, and then this data on the judicial independence to actually run this analysis on 49 sub-Saharan African countries. And what I find is that if you look at countries that score very low on this metric of judicial independence between 0 and 1. So at 0, you are a judiciary that is dependent on the executive. In the middle, between 0.4 and 0.6, you are actually 0.3 and 0.6, you are a judiciary that is semi-independent. In other words, you have some semblance of independence, but you are not completely independent from the control of the executive. And then on the very right, on the extreme, is where you have these countries that are now quite independent. So you have your Botswanas, your South Africas, your Ghanas to a large extent, right? And so in running that analysis, I kind of get this generalization that we can be able to look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africans, and see the extent to which the variation in judicial independence can determine the extent to which the incumbents and or the election losers actually decide to strategically employ election violence, right? And then the case study, because I'm from Kenya, like I said, it was, for the most part, I'm more intimate again with the politics of that country, and it's on the forefront in terms of
disputed elections and violence.
So it provided a very interesting case study for me to do field work on and really be able to kind of have a whole case study that is just pretty much focused on Kenya. And this is what I would say, that for the most part, Kenya is the one that I was able to test this theory on, right? And then having tested this theory on Kenya, I was able to now test the theory on 49 sub-Saharan African countries to see the extent to which this theory has the capacity for global travel. And then the other country that I looked at also is Uganda, but with Uganda, I did not do a field study there. I did a focused comparison analysis, basically, just looking at the cases that, at the elections that have been conducted in Uganda, looking at the progression of the judiciary over time, during Museveni's time, and then where they are today, because it's a relatively dependent judiciary.
The aspect of judicial independence is at the core of the argument that you advance in this book. What specific set of laws that define judicial independence?
Let me just take a quick step back real quick before I answer your question. Mm-hmm. Because the main argument I'm making in this book is, if you look at this, as we try to understand, and of course, this field of election violence is relatively new. So as we try to understand some of the ways in which we can prevent election violence, we have seen a lot of work, dedicated towards, like election management boards, right? Work related to attitude transformation, or, investing in the security sector and such processes. What has really been missing from the literature is focusing on one institution that every country has, that is, whose main purpose is dispute resolution, and that is the courts. So I feel like that has been lacking. So, but as we fast forward now to come to answer your question in terms of the legislation, the countries that have been able to maybe build some capacity around professionalize the judiciaries, they have passed legislation whereby the terms of like a tenure and retirement of the judges, recruitment and removal of the judges, objective advancement procedures of the judges are not necessarily, left to the president to determine that, right? So what the countries have done, particularly let's say with Kenya in the 2010 constitution, what they did is they set up a judicial commission. And what the Judicial Commission does is that its role is to be able to actually vet the judges and the judges and the justices that serve on the different courts within the country. So what that does then is that it's taking away the power of the president to be able to handpick his cronies or people who would actually be more likely to
rule in favor of him.
To rule in favor of him, right? So that is one side. And then the other component is the legislation, because the parliaments have been able to also play a critical role. So after the Judicial Commission actually interviews these judges, and then they have, let's say, 10 that they say would be good candidates, they would then come before the parliament to actually be vetted through parliament. So the legislature also plays a very key role here. So if you are a member of the opposition and you know that looking at the track record of this judge, they have maybe for the most part been aligning with the government of the day in their rulings, then you might be able to raise those types of questions, right? And so the Judicial Service Commission and the legislature, parliament for our case, they play a very important role. And so in various country constitutions, it is spelled out clearly how the advancement procedures, the recruitment procedures for the judges are going to look like, right? And then the advancement and the retirement of those judges. For instance, if previously, before Kenya had a new constitution in 2010, like I said again, the president had the power to appoint the chief justice, and they had the power to fire them. And so you would really be hard pressed to find a case where the judge would have ruled in contravention with the appointing authority. Because again, this is about professional development of the judge. And so if they rule unfairly and the appointing authority is aggrieved that they have not ruled in their favor, they are very likely then to, withdraw that position and award someone else. And so by actually creating this institution, the Judicial Service Commission, and the role of the parliament to be able to vet these judges, you bring more players to the table, but also you constrain the executive. What the executive only does then is that after these candidates have actually been vetted and they are brought before the judge, the executive or the president, he can then just appoint them. And so his role is really ceremonial. And so to this extent, actually, and when I was looking at the case of Kenya, like I can see the progression of how when Kenya, before from independence all the way to 1997, Kenya was, for the most part, the judicial was under the control of the executive. And you can see in 1992 and in 1997, so in 1992, Kenneth Matiba loses the elections, and then he petitions the outcome of the election.
Mm-hmm.
But then his case is dismissed on very trivial grounds. They said because his sworn affidavit was signed by his wife, and so it could not be accepted in court. So they threw that out.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is Kenneth Matiba, of course, was one of the guys that had been agitating for the multi-party democracy, and so he was in detention, and so he was paralyzed, so he could not actually, write. So his wife signed
he
on
had
his
to
behalf.
okay.
So his wife signed on his behalf, and then
Uh-huh.
they threw the case out. And then in 1997, Mike Kibaki also lost elections, and then he petitioned the outcome of the election. He took his case to the court. But at that time, the requirement was that you actually have to serve the respondent with you have to serve the papers to the respondent. And so you can imagine how difficult it is to scale the fence and try to go into the state house in order to serve the president with the papers, right? So then the case was actually also thrown out on those grounds that the respondent was not served
with the dossier. Oh my God.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So but we kind of move away from that, and then we in 2002 we have a new government that comes into place that for the most part is actually a conglomeration of the former KANU, the ruling party people, and also the opposition with Raila Odinga. But what they do then is they kind of introduce minimum reforms to try to kind of change the courts. But what they did was, so these reforms were quite minimum. So the people were appointed from the people that were, in fact, the Minister of Justice at that time had said that they were going to do a radical surgery of the judiciary, but it was not in the constitution. Like the changes were not made within the constitution. It was more, the changes that were made were literally more in practice. And so you had actually people that had been supported in these positions, the judges that are coming in that are being supported by the president, and then those who are supported by the former members of the opposition, right? So you kind of have a dueling of allegiance within the constitution, within the judiciary, between kind of these two different factions, so to speak. And so when the 2000 elections are actually disputed, and we have one of the most violent post-election outcome there, you have an opposition that is kind of feeling like they could actually be able to strategically engage in election violence in order to actually force the judiciary to be more impartial if the case was going to come before them. And then in 2010, we have a new constitution that now literally introduces these guardrails, Judicial Service Commission and the role of the legislature in exacting the Judicial Service Commission and the legislature and their role in constraining, the power of the executive in how it gets involved, in the judiciary. And what you have actually seen then is from that time in 2013, the Supreme Court rules in favor of Uhuru Kenyatta's winning the elections. And the opposition candidate, Raila Odinga, says we don't agree with the ruling, but we respect the ruling. Because what you have seen then is that there's actually both sides of the incumbent and also the opposition see that there has been an effort in making this arm of government independent. And so the ruling that comes out of that is respected by both parties. And so to that extent, Raila, instead of going to the streets like he did in 2007, he actually goes to the courts to ask for a ruling on this case, right? And when they rule in favor of Uhuru Kenyatta, who had won the elections, he respects that. He doesn't call his supporters to go out on the street. And that was also the same case in 2017, when the elections were disputed again, and he takes his case to court again, and the Supreme Court rules in his favor and becomes the first African court to actually nullify a presidential election. And so with that, then you see a lot of trust, coming that we can actually be able to believe
in the judiciary,
in the judiciary as a dispute resolution mechanism when we disagree about the outcome of the elections.
So is he going to run in the next year's election?
It's looking that way. I think it's gonna be like a Hakainde Hichilema. In Zambia, he had run like 3-4 times without winning. That's right. So now I think Raila is gonna run again. He has not declared, but Raila Odinga will very likely run. All the indicators are that he's going to run. And in my view, he's been fighting for reforms. And one of the latest has been, these are Building Bridges initiative that tries to address historical issues that, have pretty much, kind of pitted Kenyans against themselves, particularly because as you know, in the African context, the economic outcomes of the different social groups, different ethnic groups are tied on to political power. So then it becomes that every ethnic group wants to be in power because that is the only way they're going to be able, to get economic development. They're going to get their hospitals or roads built. And so there's a lot of reform that Raila has fought for for Kenya as a country. And even the new constitution in 2010, it was for the most part driven by his agitation by the opposition party that he led.
Well, like I said earlier before, it has become a trend that it's now the courts that decide the outcome of an election after it has been contested, other than the election itself. Can African states hold free and fair elections? Or in other words, to put it much more clearly, is it possible to conduct presidential elections in Africa or in Kenya in particular that meet internationally recognized standards?
That's a difficult question, but this is what I would say. I would say that we let's look at some of the examples of the countries that have conducted elections that maybe the international community and maybe observers have viewed as being free and fair. So I mean, the most recent ones with Hakainde Hichilema, right? He won those elections fairly. Of course, Edgar Lunga complained and said, no, the elections were rigged, but he was in power. So the likelihood of the opposition rigging elections is less because, of course, they don't have the control of the state machinery. And of course, then Malawi, then Malawi has also conducted the elections fairly and that are generally acceptable. And then, of course, Botswana, and then, of course, South African and countries like Ghana. Those countries have, for the most part, been able to conduct elections that are acceptable across the board. But also for every Ghana, you have Uganda. For every Botswana, you have
Zimbabwe.
You have Nigeria. And so I would say that, yes, it's possible, but this is going to take time. And I think I'm encouraged by, the work that has been done by Lindbergh. He writes about the research that he does on Ghana, that he talks about, democracy by doing, that the more we do elections, the better we get, and the more the people get sensitized to be able to demand more. And so countries that conduct more elections then are moving away from just being these electoral democracies to actually now being liberal democracies, right? It happens over time. But I think the biggest stumbling block is the lack of respect for term limits. Because if you are a president and then you have a majority in the legislature, you can use the majority in the legislature to change the rules so that you remove term limits and then you remove age limits. We've had Paul Kagame has done that. Paul Biya, Cameroon, has done that. You have Yoweri Museveni has done that in Uganda. Congo, the president for Denis Sassou Nguesso, Congo president for Congo Brazzaville has done that. So you have presidents that are in power that are actually using the majority in the legislature to change the rules and stay in power forever. The challenge with that is that the opposition will always feel aggrieved, because unless they have an overwhelming majority to win elections, those in power, the incumbents, can always use the state machinery to actually rig elections to influence an outcome that is favorable to them. And also, some work that has been done by Nick Chisman, which shows that if you have an open seat that is not being defended by an incumbent, there's a 50-50 chance of either the opposition winning or actually the incumbent winning. So it increases the odds of actually having a regime turnover when you have term limits and there's an open seat. But in those instances where the seat is being defended by the incumbent has an 80% chance of winning. So imagine the opposition parties within this country who have these good ideas, and they're doing their campaigns, but in the midst of that, the likelihood of actually them bringing about the change that they envision has a 20% chance of happening. So to answer your question, I think what I'm saying is that we have seen some progression towards some of the African countries that actually are conducting elections and are moving towards conducting elections that are respected by the losers also, as well as the international community. The outcomes are agreeable to both parties, both the losers of the elections and also the international community. But we have also seen some countries where these leaders who have been in power for a long time are digging in their heels and changing the rules to favor them to stay in power forever. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag. You're going to see countries that will be the vanguards for democracy in Africa, and those who are still, are lagging behind. But I also have to say that African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, have been really practicing democracy for the second phase since 1990. At the end of the Cold War, 1989, that is when you actually reintroduced multi-party politics in 1990 in Benin, and that we see that wave going all the way to the rest of sub-Saharan African countries. And so to that extent, an average African country has been conducting elections for, let's say, 30 years, right? So democracy in Africa is still young, is still an experiment, and some countries are getting the experiment right. Some of them are actually, taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I'm more optimistic that over time, we'll be able to get there as we actually build our institutions, as we professionalize our institutions, and we build capacity in electoral management boards, we build capacity in the courts to be able to arbitrate in these disputes. And so I think we're going to be able to get there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We remain optimistic that change will come, and that change will be deep-seated so that it's enjoyable in the long run. Viewers and listeners, Professor Meshack Simati is a professor of political science and global studies at California State University, San Marcos. His new book, Post-Election Violence in Africa, The Impact of Judicial Independence, was published by the Routledge Taylor and Francis Group. I'm very much happy to have heard you, Professor Meshack. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Anotida, for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, and have a good day.